This is a work in progress. I have not thought about or done this particular thing in any other forum, so it's kind of thinking my way through something. So I hope you'll indulge that, but also possibly help me to make it go better. However, it does belong to a quite long series. I'm not sure whether it's a trilogy or a kind of Game of Thrones open-ended series that we'll never finish. But it's a quite long series on what I'm calling, along with some other people, cultural science. So I thought a way to make cultural science work would be to test it out on some contemporary television, and that's what this talk is about. It's about not just humans and Westworld, but a cultural science approach to humans and Westworld. And it should work like that. Yes, it does. So first of all, I want to explain why I think cultural science is needed when we have science in one place and cultural studies in another. What's at stake in inventing a new subdiscipline or interdisciplinary area called cultural science. And the main reason, I think, is because of the dawning of global consciousness over the past what might now be maybe 50, 60 years, or perhaps even longer. But during the 20th century, it was not only the case that trade, economics and warfare were globalized, but for the first time, people's knowledge of each other, people's connectedness, as it were, person to person, and people's media entertainments were globalized. This was perhaps best what should we say, marked by the launch of the satellite Telstar in 1962, which was the first time that live television pictures could be transmitted across the Atlantic. So the dawning of global consciousness was very much a technological achievement, and quite a recent one. I actually remember Telstar. And it allowed for television to be understood as a global phenomenon rather than just a national one. However, as we've come to realize, going global doesn't mean everything becomes the same, doesn't become uniform. So the idea that we would all be dominated by some kind of American monoculture has clearly not eventuated. And so it remains to explain how culture, consciousness, media, knowledge, can be globalized. How does it work? What's the process? What's the system? What's the model for understanding all of that? And I use two of these spheres that I've borrowed from a Russian tradition or a Russian-Estonian tradition of both science and cultural studies. I borrowed the idea of the semiosphere from the Estonian-Russian author Yuri Lotman, and the idea of the noosphere from a predecessor of his, Vladimir Vernadsky, who also invented the term biosphere. So we're talking about ways in which our planet has is not only capable of being studied as a kind of unitary phenomenon, but also how knowledge itself is becoming global and how to think about that. So we start from that. And the kind of first insight is that if you look at the semiosphere, it's not one sphere of culture around the world. It is more like plate tectonics, where there are points and forces of pressure pushing against each other and creating rifts and divisions, and also volcanism and earthquakes at points of connection. And this is where new material is formed and where new land is generated, in actual fact, in the geosphere. And the same goes for the noosphere, the sphere of thought. It's not like everybody's thinking the same. It is much more like global flows, like the atmosphere, global flows, local turbulence, and local intensities. So this is the kind of model that we're working from. In terms of cultural science is intending not to start from scratch, but to take two existing fields, cultural studies on the one hand and the biosciences on the other, and link them in order to find ways of explaining what the other cannot do easily. So cultural science uses evolutionary and systems approaches to explain culture, which means studying populations rather than individuals or semiospheres rather than individual texts. And it's interested in these borders of turbulence and difference as much as it is interested in the separate individual semiospheres or systems. And the same thing goes the other way, that cultural science is not seeking to explain culture away in scientific terms. It's seeking to bring to the attention of the biosciences and the complexity sciences in particular the need to understand language, relationship, reflexivity, meaning, identity, and also communication, context, power, and knowledge, the things that make cultural studies what it is. This one. The basic proposition of cultural science is that culture makes groups as an evolutionary adaptation among humans, and that groups make knowledge. So we don't see culture as something to do with art. We don't see culture even as something to do with whole way of life in the usual sense of that, although it does, that is a description that can be used. We see culture as an evolutionary mechanism for producing human groups where cooperation is possible at greater than the extent of kin. So humans are very unusual in that they can cooperate with each other among non-kin and in quite large groups. And it's culture that makes that possible, is the argument, through various mechanisms for establishing trust among we groups and hostility towards they groups. So we have a cultural pattern which we think is very ancient of the division of humanity into we groups and they groups, and that we know who we are among these groups through language, knowledge, sociality and relationships of various kinds, from which our identity as individuals can emerge. And we know who they are because they talk funny, and they're not to be trusted, and they tell lies, and they want to kill us, or they want to steal our cattle. And we tell many stories of that kind about various kinds of they, and we have various stratagems for testing their trustworthiness, like, for example, have they got French accents, that kind of thing. And Rob didn't like that, but it's like it's why the West cannot accept continental theory. It's just simple. So there are we-they mechanisms for producing communities of trust and communities of distrust, and that is culture's job. It's what it does. So we suggest that although that is the case, the kind of ironic fact is that new ideas do not emerge from within groups, but between them. New ideas emerge from the clash or conflict or competition or even cooperation between different types of groups. And so if you're interested in the growth of knowledge over long periods of time, epochs, then it's no good looking at one culture. You have to look at how cultures connect with each other tectonically and how ideas flow from one to another atmospherically. So we suggest that translation, collaboration, competition, clash, conflict, and conquest are all forms of cooperation. Now, conquest as cooperation sounds like, one of those provocations. But in fact, unless communities that are small consolidate into larger ones, they cannot accept competition from others, outsiders, who are better armed than they are. So a lot of the ancient history of humanity comprises communities forming into states or kingdoms or monarchies of various kinds, which were enlarged sufficiently to be able to absorb attack from the outside. This is a theory of history coming out of people like Peter Turchin, War and Peace and War, and also sociology of war and violence by Sinisa Malesevic, a very good analysis of the difference between individual aggression, which does not explain warfare, and organized complexity, which does explain warfare. So suggesting that warfare and conflict are produced by large-scale cultural groups in order to defend themselves against lethal attacks of various kinds. And that's an evolutionary process. Obviously, working hand in hand with technologies, for example, technologies of weaponry. And the same thing applies over in the economy, that economies have grown by producing we and they groups. Among these, although not often discussed, I don't think, are the groups that we know as either slaves or classes. And I put up there the title of a book which makes a history out of that process, suggesting that capitalism and the Industrial Revolution are all based on slavery, and that the difference that people draw between slave societies and worker societies, or between capitalism and states, is more apparent than real, that these things grew up, as it were, in each other's pockets through the history of cotton, interestingly enough. And there's also a picture down there which is kind of saving for later, and that is the development of classes in opposition to various forms of complex organisation. What you're looking at is another story, the fearless girl standing up to the bull, is it the bull market or the bear? Bull market, yes, in Wall Street. So that's, but there's some politics going on around that. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? Fearless girl, yeah. Well, not just Occupy, it's the fearless girl in particular has become a kind of meme. So there's the question of whether we are slaves or classes and what that means in relation to the growth of organised communities of not only we versus they in the external world, but we versus they in our own communities. So, conquest as cooperation, conflict as cooperation, and the relations between opposing groups as the process by which new ideas are generated and circulated is where we start from. I've worked with Henry here, and I'm currently working with Lucy as well, on various ways to make cultural science more less abstract and more applied to particular circumstances. So we've written a book on cultural science, creative economy based on cultural science, which instead of talking about artists and producers, tries to look at the creative industries, creative economy, as a process of including whole populations, not just the economy but also culture, and not just elite nations but also anywhere in the world. So we're trying to look at culture population-wide in the contemporary economic environment. And we find that it's not only necessary to do that, but it's also necessary to accept the challenge of various problems that arise in that context. And we've classified these as the three buts. We haven't got a T-shirt of the three buts, although we do have a T-shirt of the three bigs, don't we? Which are various kinds of divide, various kinds of control, and various kinds of problem of sustainability, various kinds of waste. That's cultural science as we currently have it. And this is an attempt to move beyond analysis of economics and policy towards something that has interested me for a long time, which is fiction. And one of the reasons why I do the humanities is because I've always been interested in drama, always been interested in speculative representation as a way of analysing contemporary problems. And so I want to find some way to bring the issues that I've just tried to outline to bear on contemporary fiction. And this is what I'm doing today. So we have Westworld. Anyone seen it? Good on you. And Humans. Anyone seen that? Oh, thank goodness. Now, I don't know how to do a straw poll, but can I get a sense of whether any of you prefer one against the other? Which of these did you like watching is what I really want to know. Westworld, yeah, okay. Nobody else willing to say? Nobody's seen both? And the reason I'm asking is because actually, for me, there is a very clear answer. I loved one, I loathed the other. And I wanted to explain that to myself. I wanted to understand why I detested Westworld so much. So now you know. And I also thought Humans is the best thing on television for years. I used to say when I was listen to it.
Better than the goodies.
Listen to it, yeah.
Come on.
Listen to it. I used to say when I was interviewed on the radio, which I used to be in my younger day, what's the best television program ever made? It was easy to answer. It was Edge of Darkness. Now it's Humans. There we are. So that's what I'm trying to get to. One is detestable, the other is defining an epoch. Meantime, we have to think more carefully about fiction. We can't just say fiction is over here and fact is over there. We can't just say the sciences do facts and the humanities do fictions or values or whatever else they accuse us of doing. We have to try and understand the relationship between fiction and knowledge and the relation between fiction and society. And one of the ways in which I found that to be possible lately is by taking notice of the work of Yuval Noah Harari. Has anyone come across Harari? Harari is a historian, a proper historian, the kind who actually looks in archives of documents. And so he is entitled to use the word history, which, as you obviously understand, keeps as far away from fiction as it possibly can under normal circumstances. One of the most hostile disciplines to postmodernism, relativism, and all the things that have been, convulsing cultural studies over the past 50 years, simply refused in the history discipline. So it's amazing to see this character coming up and saying that the one thing that distinguishes human beings from anything else is fiction. And what he says is that what humans do distinctively is they make things that they live by that do not exist in nature. And the things they make include, and this is his list, not mine, nations, corporations, religion, crusades, money, and law. And one might add also science. These are mental systems, noosphere artifacts that we quite clearly live by in ways that seem imperative. We have no choice. We must live in these fictions. And I'm personally drawn to this because I remember getting outraged when I read the American Declaration of Independence. Now, I don't know if any of you have read the American Declaration of Independence, but it bases itself on something called natural law. Natural law is quite clearly a fiction. There's no such thing as natural law. It's an artifact. You know that it is as soon as you read this thing. And yet an entire constitution and then 200 years of subsequent history is founded upon this fiction. So it's still with us, the idea of these fictions driving who we are. What is Apple? Actually, Harari doesn't ask that question. He asks the question, what is Peugeot, which is an interesting question. It's a car firm. But what is it? Where does it exist? How can you fall over it? Same goes for big corporations like Apple. They're, in some senses, non-existent, immaterial constructs, and in other senses, about as real as human life can get in the contemporary period. So I'm interested in fictions in that strong sense, not fictions as escape from the real, but fictions as the things that make the real for this species. And I would like to say that this is not a new idea, even though it's newly expressed by a historian, because culture itself, the processes of culture, the making group processes of culture, has spent quite a few millennia thinking through some problems that fictions are also involved in solving. And that is, I put it quite simply here, questions about when and where the we community, we, stop. And to get you to think about this, the when we stop is just as interesting as the where we stop. Where we stop at the borders. And then we might fight over those borders, we might expand those borders, we might even have to contract them occasionally. It's kind of easy to understand a cultural group in terms of space, although it gets more complicated when you get down to realities. But when you think about when are we, that is a really interesting question, because dead people live among us. People who have never existed live among us. and people who once were alive, or we may even have known, remain as actors on social stage long after they're dead. For example, people weren't sure whether the community included the ancestors, or the community included, I don't know what you call them, external beings who had never lived, like gods or spirits or whatever the name that we kind of give them. And there's a lot of current archaeology organized around the question of places like Stonehenge, like the Ness of Brodgar in Shetland, my favorite, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, and lots of other pre-Neolithic, that is Paleolithic or Mesolithic remains, which are quite clearly organized around people collecting together in order to celebrate, to feast, to do something that declares their we-ness before farming, before cities, before pottery. Big stone circles. Remarkable. What were they doing? What were they communicating? And who were they communicating it to? And part of the answer must be they were trying to determine where we stop. Do we stop at the ancestors? Do we stop at people who are alive? How are the two things connected? That's not gone away. We still have equestrian statues for our leaders who are long dead. Most of you in this room will have heard of dead people who you are required to admire, people like Marx, etc. Hall, Hawkes, John Berger. They stay with us. It's not quite clear when people are extant and not extant in terms of their cultural usefulness. So I'm quite interested in that question of when cultures stop, what their borders are in time as well as space. And I notice that scholarship is being devoted to that kind of question, that kind of problem too. So where do we stop? When do we stop? How do we know? I put something from Matt in there to talk about extinction studies, a very interesting way of thinking about stopping, and also the work of Donna Haraway, who is noted for her interest in the relationship between human and non-human going towards machine beings of various kinds. Going back to reality, the question of artificial intelligence is not being posed in terms of what can we do with it, but who's winning. If you look at, it's not quite today's, but it's close. March, New York Times, they're reporting on evidence that robots are winning the race for American jobs, and that's based on National Economic Review research. And at the same time, Harari himself has written another book in which he's basically suggesting that if you want the history of the future, it is that humans are becoming a useless class, and that we are in fact going to be dissolved into our other at some point in the future. So the red bit is his writing. He says, organisms are in actual fact algorithms. Human beings, giraffes, viruses are algorithms. They differ from computers only in the sense that they are biochemical algorithms which have evolved at the whim of natural selection over millions of years. And those of you who've seen Westworld will remember the Anthony Hopkins character saying that evolution is trillions of mistakes. That's his definition of evolution, trillions of mistakes over a long time, produces whatever it is that we are now. So that process of evolution that is applied to life forms applies equally to algorithms and to artificial intelligence in this view. And in that process, there are sides, there are we and there are they, and they are currently winning. And this is journalism and history, not fiction, I point out. So we need an expanded concept of fiction, as I've mentioned, that expanded concept of fiction works the other way too. Instead of just saying, well, there's over here is fiction and over here is fact, we can see fiction as a space of experiment in the product of new scientific knowledge. So many people will know that the history of rocketry begins not with, is it Tsiolkovsky, the Russian rocket maker, but with Jules Verne, who inspired him to invent rocketry. That kind of thing. Science fiction, science, technology, and the growth of knowledge are linked causally, not just analogously. And in that context, there's been a very interesting and marked change in recent science fiction, which I think of as a kind of feminization. So I've put in a little nod to one of my own predecessors, I think, Helen Merrick, who used to be here, who wrote a book which was received as an indispensable social and cultural history of the girls who have been plugged into science fiction. And in that context, the extent to which science fiction itself is feminizing, people like Anne Leckie and N.J. Jemisin are producing work that is now winning the prizes that used to be won only by men. So science fiction itself is shifting around and thinking about these questions that I've been trying to raise. So fiction itself becomes an efficient means for exploring possible futures for selves and societies. That's speculative fiction, which we otherwise might know as history, and for the growth of knowledge itself, which is science and science journalism. Fiction is also being increasingly used in formal knowledge itself. So you have fictocriticism, Stephen Meucci does that. You have scenarios in science, possible futures and counter-futures. You have storytelling as absolutely normal nowadays, and what Yuval himself, Harari himself calls the history of tomorrow, which is a contradiction in terms, of course. So fiction extends knowledge by its own particular methodologies. These include narration, plot, character, and conflict. Narration is going on too long here, apparently, so there's also the question of economy of time. So if you're seeking to understand agency and context and causal sequence in complex evolving systems, then storytelling, narration, plot, character, and action are among the means that we use to understand those things. Meantime, how do you work up from fiction to whole-scale populations and global societies? The traditional means for doing this, and I'm saying traditional in a very kind of truncated sense, it's only been traditional since about 1955 or so, is television, which is where I came in. Television was noted in the 50s, 60s, and 70s for the work that the medium did, popular television entertainment, the work that the medium did in producing the kind of modern subject, the subject of modernity, the private household, the consumer, as it were, the American housewife model of being modern, one who is secular, who is involved in family reproduction, and so on and so forth. Sort of stuff that Lynn Spiegel studied so well in her work. So television was the place where the modern subject, the subject of contemporary consumer capitalism, is narrated, represented, and to some extent taught. But that kind of television is no longer with us, as you know, and so we have to rethink what it is that television is doing, and we have to rethink how fictions are being scaled up to society level. So that's part of the task of what I'm trying to do now. And I've changed the question around from how do you produce the modern subject, the kind of docile consumer, to what does it mean to be human in an era of power? And I think that's the original cultural studies question, still is, except that it needs now to be posed differently through speculative TV drama, for example, where, I'm quoting Harari again, modernity is a deal, he says, the entire contract can be summarized in a single phrase. Humans agree to give up meaning in exchange for power. So his answer to the question, what is it to be human in an era of power, is that we abandon meaning. We become meaningless in ourselves, we're just algorithms, and we have no meaning in our lives because we're after power. At last, I hear you cry, we can see some pictures. Now this is Westworld.
You know where you are. Purple tree. That's right, Dolores. You're in a dream. Or you're a question of nature of your reality.
Welcome to Westworld. No orientation. No guidance. All our hosts are here for you. In this world, you can be whoever you want.
Are you real?
Well, you can't tell. Does it matter?
This behavior miles beyond the glitch here. What are your plans? To meet my maker.
I think there may be something wrong with this world. Something hiding underneath. This island divides, and island ends.
I am sure you'll agree it's a really good example of one of those instances, they're quite common, where the trailer is much better than the series. Oh, wrong way, sorry. Go back. Now, this is season 1 of Humans. So that's what we're talking about. I want to bring in the concept of the Anthropocene at this point, but it will just float off to the side, possibly because it's too big to develop in the time available to me, which I gather has just run out. So I'll press on very quickly and say, what are the kinds of questions that cultural science can ask in relation to these fictions? And the questions might be, what are the limits of the human? Where do we stop? Where do they begin? What is consciousness in an age of automation? What is the relationship between self or identity and society or group at planetary scale or species scale? What happens when computation knows more than humans do? And how can artificial intelligence systems balance meaning and power? And the questions are going to be answered by comparing the two shows. So you'll see shortly that I make a distinction between two what look like binary oppositions, Westworld, Humans. But they're not binary, they're in a Venn diagram relationship where there is overlap and contrast, and possibly even conflict. But what we're looking at is a universe that has both of them in it. And so we're sort of understanding the identity of each by looking at the other. And so going back to the we and they model, I've put on the first of the Venn diagrams that on one side we have we, which is the place of universal truth, and on the other side we have they, which is the place of adversarial distrust. And in between we have a translation zone of both newness, new ideas, and conflict. And that we can inspect the two series through this lens, or these lenses. So, narratives of newness in the two areas also reflect oppositions in the critical domain. And I've gathered some of these oppositions into two sets, what I call builders and breakers. On one side, we have creative productivity. The other side, we have creative destruction. That's Schumpeter. On one side, we have institution building. On the other side, we have critique, opposition to institutions. So we have capitalism, we have Wall Street. On one side, we have growth and power. On the other side, we have novelty and change. That's artistry, originality, that kind of stuff, avant-garde. On one side, we have economics, boo. And on the other side, we have cultural studies, hooray. Okay? However, the whole point of this model is that you can't have one without the other, and you can't make new ideas without the clash between these two opposites. So clash, conflict, competition between these systems is the source of newness and innovation, and that newness that we value emerges from these differences. So hold your hostilities for a moment, and we will go to the two sides of the two shows. So asking questions of the two shows. What semiosphere do they come from? Well, the national and cultural semiotic traditions that produced each of them are very distinct. Humans comes from Europe. The original series was called Real Humans, came from Sweden. I haven't seen it, so I can't talk to you about it. But it was remade by Channel 4 in the UK. So it's a strictly European phenomenon, whereas Westworld is very clearly an American show coming out of an American tradition, including that of Hollywood, a film with Yul Brynner in it, back in the 70s, I think, wasn't it, or 80s? Can't remember. 70s, yeah, old time. Just don't smoke. The question, what is the problem? The problem at system level, at population level, at planetary level, what is the problem? And I'm going to say that in the American semiosphere, the unresolved social anxiety and running sore of history is slavery. Whereas in the European tradition, the unresolved social anxiety and running sore of history is class. If you get nothing else out of this talk, that's what I'm trying to say. It's a battle between slavery and class. And at individual character level, the unresolved problem of culture, meaningfulness, is, in Westworld, power, in Humans, meaning. Now, I've also put some pictures up there which somewhat complicate the issue. You'll see the top row is slavery, where girls are sold into slavery to alarming effect. And at the bottom one, you see Victorian London, where girls are sent to factories with alarming results. And the uniting figure in both of those schemes is cotton. So, what characterization, what are the characters about? The driver of characters' motivation in Westworld is individualism, greed, wealth, the other as ant. In Humans, it's mutuality, love, family, law, the limit of sociality, and the obligations of each to the other. The most important character, the one who achieves consciousness in each of the two shows, is not entirely clear because it's not only these two, but we are invited to perceive what's going on through Dolores in Westworld and Anita, who becomes Mia in Humans, Gemma Chan. There are other things to say about that, but I haven't left myself enough time, so never mind. What is the relationship that is depicted to represent these connections among humans and among not humans? Well, in Westworld, it's sex, a transmission model of relationship, where you can have whatever you want, particularly if you're a bloke. Whereas in Humans, it's love or translation. So I'm making a distinction between transmission relationships and translation relationships, difference between sex and love, that's the names they're given, where newness is produced out of difference. In Westworld, the relationship is death, you win or lose. In Humans, the relationship is compromise or accommodation. You learn, you tolerate, and so on. Furthermore, as Eleanor knows, relationships with robots is not confined to the kinds of things that we're talking about here, human-looking robots. There are other kinds of robots with whom we have relationships, and there are also other kinds of beings with whom we are said to have relationships. The most famous one at the moment is Beast, as long as it's loved by Emma Watson. So, control myself. What's at stake? The reveal. What happens at the end? Catastrophe in Westworld, a catastrophe that cost $100 million. That's some catastrophe. You can see it in the trailer, can't you? The money's on the screen. It's beautiful. Everybody's dead. In humans, oh sorry, that was a spoiler. Spoiler alert, yes, sorry. I meant to do that earlier. Oops. In humans, it's compromise. It's only a $12 million sorry, I beg your pardon, £12 million budget for Series 1. I don't know what Series 2 cost. But it's not designed around the risk of control or death. It's designed around humanness reinterpreted. Humans and non-humans living together despite what they know about the other. So that picture of the family, they're called the, what are they called? The Hawkinses. The Hawkins family is at the centre of humans. And the one that used to be called Anita is now called Mia. The synth starts in their domestic environment as a domestic servant and ends up as a conscious being. And this moment is when the mother, who is also a lawyer, recognises that fact. So the resolution is winning in Westworld and cohabiting in humans. What about the robots? Well, the perspective of the of robotics that the series explores again comes down in Westworld to power, that of the owner, the controller, or the producer, known in that particular fiction as Ford or Anthony Hopkins, the big name actor in the series. In humans, it's what I think of as the perspective of the user. We see the first robot in a household, in a family, in suburbia, in a recognisably present-day environment. Whereas the Westworld production design is all corporate steel and glass and grey and blue, and an entirely fictional landscape that comes straight out of Westerns, obviously, and does not exist in the world that the guests actually belong to. So, the perspective differs. What do the robots think when they think? Well, the first thing that robots do in Westworld is to make a decision to be free. It's a freedom discourse. But the first thing that robots do when they think for themselves in humans is that they think they're a class. The Niska character, who you haven't seen before, Emily Berrington, the blonde person at the bottom there, starts out as a sex worker synth and ends up as the kind of rebel leader. And the first thing that she thinks of when she thinks is how to connect with others and put together a rebel organisation. So that's the difference between the two. What's the general pattern then? Those three pictures at the bottom tell the story. In my view, Westworld is a fiction of breakers. Humans is a fiction of builders. The first tests individualism to destruction, so the only interest it has in children, who are treated very interestingly in Westworld. You should look at the children. They kill them, but they don't kill them kind of beautifully. They're just kind of, off camera. But one occasion when they do dissect a human child beautifully, this is what it looks like. It's a function of the will of the proprietor, and the face does that, as you can see. Whereas the role of the child in humans is to welcome the other into the family, into the context, into the circumstances. The Sophie character, who accepts the synths, for what they are, and becomes the kind of agent of familiarization. And in between them, there is Mia herself, now Mia, not Anita. She's Anita when she's blue and Mia when she's red, I don't know why. That is her experiencing love. And I just need you to know that the background, thank you, Eleanor knows what's coming because she follows me on Instagram, is where I grew up, in Westgate-on-Sea in Kent. the least charismatic part of England that you could possibly imagine. It is Dagsville. It is John Clark writ large. And there she is, becoming human in that environment, not in a kind of charismatic corporate environment. It's a very different take on what we're trying to discuss. Oops. So, coming back to reality, we discover that fiction is now, well, not only weaponized by one side of politics, but being resorted to by the other side of politics in order to work out what the hell is going on. So how did we get to the American election result and the Trump presidency? The apparently sales of 1984 of, Brave New World and of It Can't Happen Here, because it can, have soared since Trump became president. People are trying to understand what the hell is going on in politics by reading classic science fiction. And furthermore, journalism is telling us that politics is made of the weaponization of fiction. Fantastic term, I think. So again, we have to draw conclusions from what we're looking at in these TV shows and try and bring them back to the wider cultural context. There's an old question in British TV, British politics, and popular culture: what about the workers? And so the question of class remains. We know that the synths are workers. They are domestic servants, sex servants, that kind of thing, in humans. And we know that the what are they called? The hosts, is that what they're called in Westworld? Are slaves. They do what they do because they have to do it. So leaving the slavery side of it aside for one moment, what about class? And what I'm trying to do with these ideas is to apply this typology that I'm developing out of those shows in my own work on knowledge groups to show how new communities may be forming themselves, gaining consciousness, understanding themselves as part of global developments which work at that kind of atmospheric noosphere level as well as in different cultural settings. And so we can think through how new groups are forming themselves by looking at these kinds of oppositions. And one example may be, haven't thought it through properly yet, girls. So I've been working with my daughter on a paper which I should be giving at the ICA in a couple of weeks' time, but I won't because I'm not going, on girls as object of knowledge. And one of the conclusions we come to is that girls are forming themselves into something like class consciousness through celebrity, through media, and through social media. And so there's a way of thinking about the formation of new groups, the production of newness out of conflict, and the relationship between what we've previously thought of as not defining or representing the human, that is girls, and new forms of consciousness, which is also them. So we can use this model to think through other problems, is what I'm suggesting. New knowledge formations which are organized around individuality in Westworld, but around groups in humans, which is why I like humans more. New groups, what perspective? Is it that of the owners and producers, or is it that of the consumers and users? Again, the two series give us different points of view. And when we go back to the Anthropocene and start thinking about that time, we have to think about Anthropocene labor. Are we looking at slaves or are we looking at classes? Is purposeful action, is it Niska or is it Maeve? Is it winning or is it adapting and cohabiting? One of the things that distinguishes the Niska character, who starts out as a sex worker, ends up as a rebel leader, is that she's claimed to be, I've got it here somewhere, yes, she's claimed to represent the best queer subplot on TV this season, according to a leading feminist and blog. So the Niska Astrid subplot is a plot about how to have difference in sexuality, difference in relationship, represented by the very person whose struggle is to escape the conditions of their production. So cohabiting. Again, is it about power or is it about meaning? This is the question, and it's a question for you to choose. If you like Westworld, you are choosing individualism, control, ownership, death, and slavery. And if you're interested in humans, well, of course, everything's fine. What about the Anthropocene? I haven't got time to go through it, but the consequences of planetary consciousness and self-knowing have become a really big issue in, I think, philosophy. So here, for example, is Sloterdijk, who I still haven't read properly, but somewhere in there, you know, globes, foam, bubbles, is that right? Are they 3 different books? I think they are. I'm looking at a map. Is really thinking through similar issues to the ones we're discussing, but in a philosophical manner. And he says the coming of the term Anthropocene inevitably obeys an apocalyptic logic. It indicates the end of any peace of mind in the cosmos on which historical forms of human being in the world rested. In other words, the Anthropocene is catastrophe, it's end, it is lack of control, it is something awful. The end of peace of mind, that's what it is. But maybe it isn't. If you look at the Anthropocene through the lens of humans, then maybe it's compromise, translating across boundaries, and using translation zones to bring opposites closer together. The human-technology opposition, the human-animal or environment opposition, and the knowledge-fear opposition. So finally, we have to say, what does translation mean in this context? I've said translation between human and non-human, translation meaning a way of representing love as opposed to sex, but Yuri Lotman, the semiotic theorist, sees translation as a much more complex process than simply transmitting an information unit across a boundary. He sees it as having 5 stages, and what I've done just to show you how this might work is to change the word text in his writing to the word robot, in order to show that the whole thing just works, because Lotman is a genius, as you all know. And you really don't need any other theorist, as I'm sure you'll agree later on. So, it starts out with strangeness. The robot consciousness is valuable because it's unknown, or the text is valuable because it's in a strange language, it's unknown. It's valuable because it's foreign. Transformation, this is the period when the robot and the home culture begin to restructure each other. They accommodate. The robot consciousness offers a chance to break with the past, spurring local experimentation. If you look at the Laura character in Humans, that's absolutely her narrative arc. She turns from hating Anita, it's a machine, we don't want it in the house, to the hug at the end of series 2. A very important arc. And translations, imitations, and adaptations, new kinds of robot, new kinds of artificial intelligence proliferate. Then there's the period of abstraction, which is that it's not the individual robot or the individual text that's important, but the codes and rules that produce a particular kind of textuality that are important. And we begin to look at them. So we look at the algorithms, not the skin. Finally, there's a period of productivity when the local culture produces new and original robot consciousness. Previously peripheral or robotic intelligence becomes core to humanness, and we develop innovation in what it means to be human from the margins, resulting in the final period, the turn-taking, the dialogic turn-taking. Instead of receiving a text from the outside or a robot from the outside, we transmit back into the world. A flood of robot consciousness crosses the human-machine border to transform the world, which is the kind of Haraway position, I think. I don't know. We may talk about that. So what I'm really trying to say is that if you're thinking about how large-scale systems transform through conflict and connection between oppositional and untranslatable units, then this model works as much for thinking about robots and artificial intelligence as it does for textuality and culture. So, as somebody said, let the games begin. Let the interaction between the human, the non-human, the human and the beast, the human and the Anthropocene begin. And it's beginning in popular culture, not in science, and certainly not in the kind of formal stuff that we tend to look at. So I just picked, almost at random, out of my feeds, something from Chill Out Point, which is, you know, a place to stick your stuff. Somebody writing, I think they're German, so the grammar's a bit odd. It happens so that people and robots go together in this life side by side. In some spheres of life, they are even interchangeable. And who knows into what this opposition, human and robots, will translate. That is the question of our times. And it's being answered on social media. Thank you.